There's no hardware required. It connects to a VoIP server to make and receive phone calls. It's as simple as that. When you use VoIP, SIP soft phone or VoIP, one of the main benefits you get over using an analog modem, which is we still support, which it would be a TAPI modem, is that you can make multiple phone calls at the same time. Whereas TAPI is limited to a single line in or out all the time. SIP, we can support up to 8 phone calls at a time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later session or in a later slide. So what I wanted to talk about real quick was the typical infrastructure that we've been seeing with our customers. The first would be with an on-premise PBX. So this is going to be those of you with a Cisco system or a ShoreTel system or an Avaya system that's on-premise. So it's usually a router and a server rack that is your VoIP system. And typically, when we have those, you have WIN-911 registering directly to that PBX, and you'll have other desk phones within your office. Pretty much any office you've ever seen with desk phones, somewhat recently, I should say, are going to have a PBX within a closet. It's running some kind of a VoIP server, and all those phones are registering to that PBX, and that's how they are able to make phone calls. If you don't have a PBX on premise, then you can sign up for a cloud SIP provider. So those are pretty common. There are plenty to choose from. Some common ones are SIP Connect, SIP.us, which is one that I like a lot, and then Vonage. So basically what's happening here is you've taken that PBX, you've moved into the cloud. Now instead of talking to an on-premise server, you're talking to a cloud-hosted service. So again, SIP.us I think is one of the easier to set up and manage. It's what I'm going to use later on in the demo toward the end of the presentation. But you could use any one of those. There are plenty more to choose from. Those are just 3 that we've had success with. There are we have a list of supported PBXs in our system requirements. You can see them on the left side here, and also some VoIP providers. Those are cloud hosted providers. So if you are using any one of these systems, we know that the system will, or WIN-911 has been tested with it. But if your PBX or cloud hosted service is not on this list, it doesn't mean that it's not going to work. It just means that we haven't tested it personally. As long as your service supports SIP, then you will be able to make phone calls with it. So don't worry about that. If it supports SIP, you most likely can use it. There's really nothing special about it. It's a pretty common protocol that is used to make voice calls when you're using VoIP. So if it supports SIP, even if it's not on this list, it most likely will be compatible with WIN-911. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through the gateway and the connections in the format. So this is what you need to configure to set up a VoIP connection within the software. So we're going to start off with the gateway. I'll just talk you through a few of the settings that are available or that you have to fill in. The first, what we're going to talk about is the gateway. So here's an image of or a screenshot of what the UI looks like. You'll just need to go to Contact, Voice, and Gateway. If you later on are configuring this system and you want some assistance, there is a help icon on the top right that you can click on that's context sensitive, and that will take you to the appropriate help file. You can also find some documentation on our website. Just go to win911.com, go to the resources section and manuals, and you'll find the same information there. All right, so here is the voice gateway setup. I'm using, like I said, the SIP.us account. So if you are using something else, obviously these IDs and whatnot will look a little bit different. The first thing you're going to need to type in is your extension number. It could be your SIP trunk number. I should back up for a moment and say that if you're not familiar with SIP and you don't have this information, you're really going to want to get in touch with your IT team ahead of time and make sure you get a SIP account created for you and they provide all the details for connecting to one of these accounts. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the next field is your display name, or it's the caller ID name if it's supported by your PBX or cloud service. Not all of them do support it. You can type anything you want in here, and regardless what you type, it may not appear on the phone. Again, it has to be supported by the particular SIP or VoIP server that you're connecting to. And if you want to receive calls, you're going to have to check this box for registration required on the left. Some servers don't require it, and they'll let you make outbound calls, but you likely aren't going to be able to make incoming calls to it. So if you want to call in and do an alarm request or a report request, that's not going to work, because if you're not registered on the server as an endpoint, then when you call that number or a number, you won't even have a number, I suppose. The VoIP server has no idea where to redirect that call because you're not registered onto the server as an endpoint. But assuming that you do have that checked, you'll have to enter in your registration name or ID. It's going to have a bunch of different names depending on the service that you're using. In my case, for SIP US, it's the same number as my user ID. If you're using Cisco Call Manager, it's an actual username instead of a number. So your user ID in the Cisco example would be your actual extension number, and then your registration ID would be some username that the VoIP administrator would have created for you. And obviously you need to type in the password for it. So it's going to be username, password, credential. If you don't have a password, which is also a scenario that we've come across, then you don't have to type a password. You can just leave that field blank. The next section is the channel, choosing your channel allocation. So the channels, you can think of them as phone lines. One channel is one phone line, and what we're allowing you to do here is choose which direction that phone line is going to work in. If you choose bidirectional, that one channel can be used for outgoing calls or incoming calls. So if you have one bidirectional channel and you're on an outbound call and you try to call in, you won't be able to call in because it's in use on an outbound call. If you select one inbound channel reserved for inbound only, then you can always call in assuming there's an available inbound channel. So if I had a bidirectional channel, could go inbound or outbound, and an inbound channel, dedicated inbound channel, I should be able to call in most of the time. And then the same is true for outbound channel. If I want a dedicated outbound channel and a dedicated inbound channel instead of one bidirectional channel, I could choose that there. So that's going to be totally up to how you guys want to configure it. I recommend having an inbound channel set aside so that, assuming you have your operators calling into the system, so that they can usually always call in even if the system's calling other operators at that particular time. So next section is more server information. The server address is going to be the actual VoIP server that you're connecting to. It can be a host name or an IP address. Again, in this case, I'm using the SIP.US server to connect to. The next section would be the proxy address. This is, even though it says the SIP proxy server address, is really the outbound proxy, and it's an optional field. You don't have to type it in. Usually your VoIP administrator will let you know if you need to type in a proxy address. Its job is to serve as kind of a redirector of traffic in certain network environments. Again, optional, not always required. NAT type, this is your NAT traversal method. If you're using a stun server or a turn server, or you can even set it to manual, this is where you choose that. I have it set to automatic in this screenshot, and that's typically what I recommend you set it to unless someone's told you specifically to change it and they have a stun server set up or they have a turn server set up and they want you to connect to it. It's kind of similar to what I was saying with the proxy address. This option is really to help your SIP signals or your SIP packets to make it through a network environment where NAT's enabled and you need to traverse different subnets and other things like that within complex networks. Again, I'd recommend just leaving it on auto. And public IP, if you do set it to manual, that's where you type it in. Public IP is just the, if you're using a cloud-based service, that's where you would type your public IP address so that the cloud service knows how to get back to you. If you have it set to automatic, you don't need to type that in. But if you are using manual, then that's when you type it in. Next is the port and SIP port. These are going to be the same usually. If your 5060 is a standard SIP port that almost every server uses. If you're using a secure channel or a secure protocol, then it's going to be 5061. And so you'd have both of these set to 5061. Most servers I've come across are all using 5060. I think I've only come across one in the past couple of years that is not. So the top port is your registration port. So that is how you the software knows which port on the VoIP server to register to, and the SIP port is the port that's going to be used for actual SIP packet traffic. Again, you're going to want to keep these the same. I've never come across a situation where they should be different numbers. Next section is your real-time transport protocol ports. These are used for media streaming, so the actual audio you hear over a phone call. These ports are usually it's usually around the 20,000, 20,500 range, but you're going to want to check with your manufacturer for your VoIP server or your cloud service to know exactly which port range you should set. Typically, you only need, I think it's 100 ports that are recommended for a single channel. So if you have one channel and you need to reserve some ports, then you would do 100 port range instead of, right now I'm doing 500 in this example. But you're going to want to check with your particular VoIP manufacturer or provider to know exactly what to put in there. And the next section would be binding address. This is where you specify which network card on your computer you want to use for your outbound calls. So if you have multiple NICs on a box, which is pretty common, you only want to use one of those network cards for outbound connections, you would select specify and type in the local IP address of that network card, and then we'll only use that network card for communicating with your VoIP server. And next is transport type. This is the actual transport method or protocol that we'll use to communicate with your server. UDP is the standard from what I've seen for SIP. Almost every server is using UDP. The other choices in here are TCP, STCP, and TLS. So TLS is a secure method, but if your VoIP server doesn't support it, you can't select it. TCP is it obviously benefits from being able to have a handshake between the clients when connecting to a server, so you know if your connection is good. UDP is a fire and forget, so you never really know if your communication is working or not. But again, that's the standard that it seems most servers are supporting, but we do support some other protocols here if your server also supports it. And the last one would be secure RTP mode. So if you want to encrypt your RTP packets, you can use this option to set that. Default's none, so you don't encrypt anything. If you change it to prefer, that means that if the server you're communicating with allows encrypted RTP packets, then you'll use it. And if you choose force, then you'll encrypt it even if the server doesn't support it, which I assume means you don't hear any audio. So you want to check with your IT team to know to see if your server supports it or not. And then the last section is I don't have a thing for it, so let me back up. The dialing prefix. If when you're entering your connections, the actual people that you're going to be calling, if you need something like a 9 in front of every number, instead of typing that on every single contact that you enter, you can put it in here. So very common number would be 9. A lot of people have to dial 9 to get an outside line. So if you put a 9 here, you don't have to type it into every single contact later on when you're configuring that. So I want to talk about the audio selection or the text-to-speech selection. The first, when you install Win-911, we're going to use the Microsoft Voices. If you're using, I think this is a Windows 10 voice, Microsoft Zero. It's also in Server 2016. When you install it, you'll choose that. It should be the only language there, I believe. If you are using a different language version or an international version of Windows, then you may have a choice there. If you don't, if you are supporting a customer that is non-English speaking customer and there is no language here, that's one of the reasons we supply our premium voices. Our premium voices are offered in a variety of different languages that you can check out on our website on the price list, or I think you can go to products and premium voices on the website, and you can read more about the premium voice there. So once you select your text-to-speech option, you can choose how fast the thing will talk to you. So default's right in the middle. If it talks too quick, just move the slider down and test it again until you get it to the speed that you want it to be at. And then the volume is defaulted to maxed out. So if it's too loud, then you can turn it down and so on. It's pretty self-explanatory. The next is a greeting message that will be read to everyone every time the system goes to call out. So if you want to customize your greeting message to say this is the so-and-so water treatment plant, you can do that here. Or if you just want to make it shorter, you can do that. And the last thing is the codec. This is the audio format that, or audio codec that Win-911 will use to create these audio WAV files. If you leave it to auto select, then Win-911 and the server will just negotiate which codec to use. If you want to specify a particular codec to use, you can choose that option, and there will be a drop-down list of all the supported codecs. The auto select should work for most people, but again, if there is some special requirement where you have to specify just a single codec, then you can do that with that other option. All right, so now what I want to do before I talk about configuring connections, which I will do in a live demo, I want to talk about the call flow and how Win-911 actually calls out. So typically what happens is you have an alarm occurs, and that alarm triggers a phone message to be sent out. So that the dispatcher sends a message to the voice module and says, hey, I have a message for you to send out to some particular contact. The voice module takes that message and queues it up into a priority queue. And what a priority queue is if we receive, our priority range is 0 to 1,000. So let's say we receive an alarm message that's priority is 500, and let's say we have a few of those messages, and then we receive another message that its priority is 1,000. So we're going to take that message and put it in front of all the other messages, so it would be the next one to be called out. If all your alarms are always priority 500 or all the same, then it's kind of first in, first out kind of method on the call out, so no one's cutting in front of anyone. But that is how the queue is working. So the call will get queued up. The voice module checks every 30 seconds, I believe it is, that if there are any new messages to go out, and if there are, then it will make a call attempt to the particular connection specified. And let's say they missed the call, so they don't answer it, or there's some kind of error or anything like that that basically means it didn't answer the phone call, they didn't get the phone call, then it will escalate to the next user in the list. And then it will continue on until someone acknowledges the alarm or the alarm goes away. So that's totally up to how you want to configure the software. In the event that someone does answer the call instead of missing it, what's going to happen is your phone's going to ring and it's going to play you the greeting message. So something like, hello, Stephen, this is the Win-911 alarm notification system. Please enter your authorization code. Your authorization code is a unique number assigned to a particular person in the system. So you type that in. It's going to read you the alarm message. Something like your fresh water tank is high as of 6:03 and it gives you the option to acknowledge it. So if I push 2 to acknowledge it, it's going to ask me for my acknowledgement code if I have that configured. And I type that in, and then the alarm is acknowledged, and the alarm gets acknowledged back in the SCADA system. So it's a very simple call flow of how, or example of how the call flow works with the new software. It's a little bit different than the version 7 product if you are familiar with that. But I'll try to demo a phone call in the live demo so you guys can hear what it actually sounds like. And with that, I'm going to actually show you guys how to create a connection, or I'll show you the server settings, and then show you how to create a connection. We'll trigger an alarm and we'll make a phone call happen. Let me jump over to that. Let that minimize. Okay, so here is the WIN-911 system. This is the UI for configuring voice. So if I want to set up a gateway, I would choose gateway here. And I have it pre-configured for SIP.us. You saw it in the screenshots earlier. So I've got a username. I don't have anything in the display name because SIP.us isn't set. I don't have it set up to support caller ID at the moment, which you can. It's an add-on feature. That's why I don't have it, but you can turn it on if you want. So I've got my registration ID, password. I've set it so that I have one dedicated inbound channel and one dedicated outbound channel. That means while I'm calling out, I should be able to call in, or always call in if my inbound channel is not in use. So it basically means I have this one dedicated channel that will never be used for call outs. I have my server address here. I've got NAT set to none because I don't need it. And again, all the default settings you saw from the presentation earlier. Once you have all your settings made, you could hit the save button. I haven't changed anything, so I can't hit the save button. And if you scroll down, you can test the SIP settings and type in a phone number, and it's going to call that number and say whether your settings are correct or not. If they're incorrect, then you'll get an error saying you couldn't even create the outbound call. If there's some networking problem, it may say that it's successful, but you can't actually deliver the call, and then you would need to troubleshoot it through the event viewer. Here's where you select the other settings for the text-to-speech. So I've got 0 selected here. I could slow it down. There's a preview button. So if you want to type in a different greeting message, hit the preview button so you can hear what it sounds like, or you just want to mess with the rate and the volume settings, you can use this preview button to hear what it's going to say. And the last tab I didn't have in the PowerPoint is the messages option. This is where you can choose whether or how long to keep undelivered messages in your outbox, I guess you can call it. So the voice module will have a bunch of messages stored that may or may not have that have not been delivered because the person didn't answer the phone. So when they call in, they can hear those messages. But if they never call in, then we don't want to keep those messages around forever. So you can set how long it takes before those messages expire, and the software itself deletes them. I believe the minimum here is 8 hours. So I could slide it down to 8. Or you could always come in here and delete all the stored messages if you maybe had an alarm flood and you're trying to get rid of a bunch of alarm messages. You can use this button to delete all the stored messages. All right, so those are the settings here to set up VoIP. If I click save, I didn't change anything, so there's nothing to save. I'm not going to do this because we're going to trigger a phone call with an alarm, actual alarm. But again, all it would do is call you and say whether your settings are correct or not. I don't have any connections configured, so that's what we're going to create right now. So I'll use the plus button. What you need to do is give it a name. So I'll just call it Steven. Put in a description. This is just to give more context to what this connection is. Maybe you want to say if it's a work phone or a home phone. That's totally up to you. It doesn't really matter. It's an optional field. And this is where you put the actual phone number that you want to dial. So we're in Austin, so I use 512. And I'm going to call the desk phone that's in this room. So I'll just put that number in. And that's who it's going to call. So now you can choose interactivity. This is where you set whether this is a person that you're going to call and they can put in a code and so that they can acknowledge alarms, or is it going to be non-interactive where we'll call you, we'll announce the alarm, but you can't do anything with it. All you can do is hear it. It's just call you, play the message, hang up. So if you choose non-interactive, then it tells you it'll tell you that you can't acknowledge alarms or request reports or anything like that. And then there's no authorization code needed for that. But if you do want to have your operators be able to acknowledge alarms, you need to set it to interactive. Your authorization code is the code that you'll have to type in once it calls you. So it'll say, hello, Stephen, this is WIN-911. Please enter your authorization code. So you can type that in here. If you are supporting caller ID, then you can make it match the phone number. So if someone does a call in to request alarms and it doesn't match the number that you have here, then it will reject the call. It's I think a little bit of overkill, but it is an option that you can turn on, and of course your VoIP server has to support it. The greeting message is where you can put a customized greeting message for a particular person. It's already going to say hello, Stephen, but if I wanted to have something else in here, I could put that in there. Maybe it's some instructions for a particular operator that you can type in here. Schedule. This is the schedule that this particular person is going to have. So you can choose from one of the default schedules, or you can create another schedule. I'm not going to talk much about schedules in this webinar. If you want to learn more about escalation and scheduling, we do have a dispatcher webinar on our website right now that you can check out. And because of that, I'm also not going to really talk about roles, but roles are a way that you can group your connections together with some type of grouping. So maybe they're all operators or they're all managers. Again, if you want to learn more about that, check out that dispatcher webinar. Next tab is the format that you want the message to be played in. The default alarm format, I think it's a little long, and I think it's really long actually. So I like to choose the short condition format. So it's just going to play in the factory talk example, the message ID, the state, and what time the alarm occurred. So it's pretty short. So I think this is the one I like to use just because it is so short and you don't have to wait for it to read a bunch of information to you. The next tab is a report format. This is the format that if you are using reports, it's going to play the message in. I choose the short report body and short report intro just so that I can speed things along. If you're not satisfied with either one of these formats, then you can change the formats yourself, and I'll show you guys that in a second. Next tab is for speech synthesis. If you have a particular user that doesn't like the text-to-speech settings that you selected for everybody, you can override it for a single person. So let's say this person says it always talks way too fast. Well, you can slow it down just for this person, so you don't have to slow it down for everybody. And then you could preview it again. I'm going to set it back to 0 because that would be way too slow. Utilizers will show you where you're using this particular connection elsewhere in the software, so what contact list you may have it in. Favorites is where when you call in, you can set favorite alarm queries. So I can say if I push 1, that gives me all alarms, or I can say all active alarms, or any one of these alarm state match sets. And I could also have it say the alarms have to be over a certain severity. I can also stick labels on it if you are using labels. Again, check out the dispatcher webinar to learn more about alarm labels. But this is where you can set, this is where you set favorite alarm queries. So you can You can think of maybe having these as this represents one location if you are using these labels. And then you can do another one that says if they hit 2, it represents another location. And so you're requesting alarms by location depending on these numbers. And the last tab are the options for this particular connection that we're configuring. The first one is acknowledgement. Should this person be allowed to acknowledge alarms or not? The default is do not allow. If I choose allow, the software will say press 2 to acknowledge the alarm. If I say require a password, it'll still say press 2 to acknowledge the alarm, but then it will ask for another number. I like to just set it to allow because I figure there's no point in having another number they have to type in if they already typed in a number in the beginning. I don't really see the point, but some people do like that, and you can use this option for that. You can even make it a different number than the authorization code that you typed in on the general tab. Next section are the delete options, whether you can delete your stored messages or not. I always set this to delete of all, so I haven't come across a particular use case where customers actually need to prevent their operators from deleting those stored messages. If I were you guys, I would always leave it to allow delete. If they're not allowed to delete, it means if they have one alarm message, if they have their alarm messages, they'll never go away. So every time they call in, it will say you have X number of old messages that they would have to listen to because they can't delete them. So I would set this to allow delete all the time. And the last section is the alarm request options. This is where you call into the system and you request alarms. What alarms can they hear? This is similar to the favorites tab, except that this is going to affect every alarm request. So I can say if this particular person calls in, they can only ever receive alarms that have this particular label attached to them. You can add multiple labels in here, but again, what this would be good for is if you are monitoring multiple systems, maybe multiple SCADA systems, and this person is only responsible for one of those systems. You could use the labels to segment the two different SCADA packages so that when this particular person asks for all alarms, he's only receiving alarms from one of those systems instead of both. That's the main use case for limiting the alarm request by label. Okay, so I've got everything set, so all I need to do is hit save, and I've created this person. So it's going to call this number. That's my authorization code. It'll always call me because my schedule is set to always, and I've got my ACK option set to always, or not always, but allow. Next section would be formats. If you want to create your own custom format, you can do that here. I always suggest starting from one of the built-in formats. So if maybe there's one thing you want to change about a format, then you can just come in here, hit this create copy button, and this is going to be in an XSL format, which is very similar to XML. We're working on creating a new documentation to help you guys create these schedules, but you're more or less putting in the variables that represent different alarm data. So this variable represents what the description is. This represents what the name is. So we're working on documentation so that you guys can create your own formats much easier. And in the future, we plan on creating a new what you see is what you get kind of format editor so that you can not have to mess with this at all, but more we're thinking a drag and drop interface for that. But this is how you would do it today. If you guys do have a particular format that you need and you're not sure how to create it, just contact the product support department and we'll create one for you and send it back. And then you just need to paste it in here and then use that format. So I'm not going to do it. Actually, you know what we'll do is we'll change this one. So it's going to, I'm going to use the short condition format. So right now the time says 9:53:45. Most people don't want 45 seconds on there, so I'll do a create copy of this, call it short alarm format 2. I'm using this identifier for my time, which is a uppercase T. If I change it to a lowercase t, then I'll just get rid of the seconds off the time. So now you can see in my preview the seconds are gone. There's a knowledge base article on our website that talks about changing these date times. If you want to check that out, feel free to do so. So now that I created that format, I would have to go back to my connection and change the format that they're using. So that's how you could edit a format. So now what we're going to do is I'm connected to Factory Talk here. I have all these alarms already triggered, so I will set them. Actually, I'm skipping a step, so let me just set these to normal and acknowledge them real quick. All right, so once I have my connections made, so I have my voice connection made, I need to go put it in a contact list. So I'll go to Tactics Basic. I have 2 tactics here. I'll edit it and I'll add my connection to it. So you can see it, this is a voice connection. It's got the voice or the phone icon versus these are all email connections that are available. I will choose it here and move it to the top. If I have multiple phone connections in this list, what I will do is put them in the order that I want them to be notified. It'll call the first person, wait till they hang up the phone or they hear the message rather, and then it will move on to the next person and so on and so on. Right now, I recommend putting a delay after of at least 30 seconds between every, even if you really just want them to go one after another, still use a delay after at least 10 to 30 seconds to give the alarm enough time to be acknowledged if they do choose to acknowledge it, so that if it gets acknowledged and you don't want to call the next person doesn't get called. If you don't put a delay, there's a chance that it'll just call the next person even if you don't want it to, just because it takes processing time for the alarm to make it through WIN-911 back to the SCADA system and then back through WIN-911 so we know the alarm got acknowledged, successfully acknowledged. So you can add people in the order that you want them to be notified, and also put in text notifications for people as well. So I'll save this, and I already have my alarms coming in, so when I trigger any alarms that belong to station 1, it's going to trigger this tactic, and that's going to trigger a phone call. So if I turn these on, I should generate 4 messages for myself here. I can check in the log viewer for these alarms. They all showed up. The phone's ringing now, so just move it closer over here. And I'll answer it.
This is the WIN-911 alarm notification system. Please enter your authorization code followed by the pound key.
So I'll put in my code, 1, 2, 3, pound.
You have 4 new messages.
I have 4 messages because I have 4
Sample
alarms.
alarm message 01 is active and unacknowledged as of 11:42 a.m. To save this message, press 1.
So I could save it if I wanted to hear it later.
Press 2.
If I want to acknowledge it,
To delete
press
this
2.
message, press. Your acknowledgement request was accepted.
So if you guys watch the screen, it will get
Sample
acknowledged.
alarm message 07 is active and unacknowledged as of 11:42 a.m.
So
To
just
save
go
this
through the
message,
whole list of
press
alarms
1.
and give me the options
To
for each
acknowledge,
one.
press 2.
So I want to
Your
acknowledge this one,
acknowledgement
so
request was
acknowledge the second
accepted.
one.
Sample alarm
And-
message 04 is active and unacknowledged as of 11:42 a.m. To save this message, press 1. Your acknowledgement request was accepted. Sample alarm message 10 is active and unacknowledged as of 11:42 a.m. To save this message, press 1. Your acknowledgement request was accepted.
So I've now acknowledged all
messages.
the alarms, and
Main menu.
it'll take me to the menu,
You
but
have
I
no
can just, at
messages.
this point, I can just hang up.
For alarm requests,
Or
press
it's
2.
going to prompt me for
For
other
report
options if I
requests
want to
by
do report
number,
requests or
press
alarm
3.
requests, but I don't
For
want to
a
do
list
that,
of-
so I'll just hang up the phone, and it will eventually time out and hang up, and if it needs to make other calls, it'll make other calls. So that's an example of what an actual call sounds like. If I click on one of these alarms, I can go look at the acknowledgement tab and see that Stephen through voice acknowledged it. In the case of Factory Talk and some of the other SCADA systems, I can even see who acknowledged it within the SCADA system. So you can see acknowledged by, oh yeah, I forgot, if you click on this it jumps, but act by WIN-911 connection Stephen voice. So you can see that gets pushed all the way back to Factory Talk. That's also true for iFix, I believe it is. No, it's not. It's InTouchME, our newest data source. Okay, so that's how you make a phone call. If I wanted to call into the system and request alarms, I would have to make sure that, one, that I have the system set to register, and that I have a phone number assigned to my SIP account. If you don't have a phone number assigned to your SIP account, you can never call in. And that's something that I would talk to your IT team about. In fact, let me go back to the presentation real quick. So a few things that I would do if you are going to set this up is set this up at a new site, or even set it up at an existing site, is get in touch with your IT team pretty early on. Do you even check to see if you even have a VoIP server available? And if you don't, then you can shop around for a third-party SIP provider like the SIP.us one that I use. And if you do have a VoIP system available, they'll need to create an account for you. A WIN-911, they may call it an extension, they may call it an endpoint. It's called different things in different PBXs. I think most people call it an extension or an endpoint. So they need to create that for you. And because voice networks are usually on their own subnet or their own network, and you're running WIN-911 on a control network, they'll need to make exceptions to make sure that traffic can reach the computer that WIN-911 is running on. So they would need to make those changes for you too. And if you're going to set up escalation on a new site, I suggest collecting your operator information early on, so you're not chasing people down trying to get phone numbers and trying to figure out what order they need to be called in, or trying to figure out schedules and things like that. So the main takeaway is that make sure you talk to people early on, and don't wait till you get on site to start trying to figure this information out, because I promise you, you're going to get delayed, and it's going to take you much longer than you expected to set this thing up, especially for the VoIP server information, because I would say 9 times out of 10, the network rules that you need to be made to make this happen are not going to be ready for you if you just show up and say, hey, I need to connect to a VoIP server. It's going to take maybe a day, maybe a couple days. In some cases, it's been weeks. It just depends on the environment that you're working in. So what we'll do now is we'll take some questions.